This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Justice Pending. I'm here with two special guests talking about a brand new podcast. It's called Finding Dolores Wulff, and I'm so excited for you to learn about it directly from the creators, Kyle and Adam. So let's kick it off. Adam, why don't you tell everyone how you found this fantastic story?
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for having us on. So my name is Adam Rittenberg. I'm a senior writer for college football at ESPN, and this is a new venture for both myself and my friend and colleague Kyle Bonagura, who you'll hear from in a minute here. Yeah, so we cover college football at ESPN mainly for the website, writing news and features and so forth. But occasionally we come across stories that maybe are somewhat related to sports, but have kind of a much broader scope. And that was certainly what happened in the fall of 2020. It was in the middle of COVID, and Kyle and I are trying to cover college football as best we can. And is there even going to be a season in some places? Trying to keep up mostly from home. And I received a message from a friend of mine who's a sports attorney and agent, who came across a Facebook post from a relative of Paul Wulff, who I knew that name. Paul, he had been a college football coach for a number of years, the former head coach at Washington State. I know he was also at Eastern Washington, and this email, had some pretty incredible news about a discovery, related to Paul's past. And so from there, I had a feeling this was something that we would be interested in. And I reached out to Kyle, who is based in Northern California, somewhat near where this incident happened, and obviously had ties to Washington State as well. I thought he'd be a perfect person to partner with. And we ended up starting to report this story initially for ESPN.com, and came out with a piece in the summer of 2021. But we both believed very early on, Claire, that this was really a story that had a much larger reach and incredible characters and storytelling that could turn into a podcast. And so we're really, really excited that all these years later, we now have this on the doorstep of coming out as a 9-part serial podcast that's part of the Unforgotten series with Wes Ferguson, who we know and who's been on this show as well. And he's been a great partner to put this out with as we're getting closer to finding Dolores Wulff.
That's great. Yes, Wes is a friend of the show, and he tipped me off to you guys and this podcast. So, I want people to learn, more about what this story is. So, Kyle, who is Dolores Wulff?
Yeah, so Dolores Wulff in 1979 was a mother of four. She was 45 years old, grew up in a traditional Portuguese family. Her parents had immigrated to the United States from the Azores, which is a small chain of islands off the coast of Portugal. They lived in this rural community outside of Sacramento in Northern California, surrounded by family, surrounded by friends. It's a very small, tight-knit community. Everything in her life revolved around her family and her kids. She had two older kids who were out of the house. Carl, who was, I believe, 21, 22 at this time, and then Anna Marie was around 19 or so, was getting ready to start college. But she had two younger sons at home, Paul and Tom, who were 12 and 16 at the time. So she was kind of just living that very stereotypical suburban rural life in 1979 before kind of the incident took place.
Yes. So, as we say at Justice Pending, set the scene for us. When did Dolores disappear, and what was going on in her life at that time?
Yeah, so for a couple of years, her and her husband Carl, their marriage had started to unravel. There were death threats made by him. There was certainly emotional manipulation, emotional abuse. No one was aware of any sort of physical abuse between him and her, but they were on the outs. And he had grown distant from the rest of her family, and had really, he was cheating on her, having affairs, pursuing, women that he worked with. It was just going bad in all sorts of different ways. And then on the morning of August 1st, 1979, she was gone. The night before, her son Carl had swung by the house. He saw her, and everything seemed normal. It was a little bit tense at the house apparently that night, but she was there, and she was in her nightgown. And then the following day, Anna Marie calls the house looking to talk with her father, who at 6:01 a.m. August 1st, 1979, tells Anna Marie that her mom is gone. And so over the course of that day, word circulates. Claims that she had ran out in the middle of the night, which no one could believe because she was incredibly afraid of the dark. She was so dedicated to her family, and from there, a police investigation began. Um, but she was never seen or heard from again.
Wow. And so, Adam, tell me, how does this strike you whenever you hear about this initial disappearance sort of gone without a trace?
Right. So yeah, I mean, Kyle mentioned the threats, and so it's important context in a sense that this wasn't completely out of the blue because of much uh, how much tension there had been in the marriage, with all those different circumstances, and how brazen you looking back on it, Carl was to make these threats. I think the context around it is important, though. Carl, by all accounts, was a functioning alcoholic or poorly functioning alcoholic, and I really believe, and Kyle does too, that I think that element made it very dismissive. Oh, he's just drinking, he won't follow through with it, and he certainly won't follow through with it given the dynamics of the family. So it's important to know, like Kyle mentioned, Dolores is from this large family, grew up in this woodland area, just west of Sacramento, rural area, and it was her family that was all around. It wasn't his. Carl Wulff grew up in rural Minnesota, essentially moved to California with no relatives, and he was on his own. And so I think that was the part of it that certainly struck us when we were, researching the story, is that he was the one that was threatening her in front of her family. But I think they dismissed it as he would never go through with it because we're here. He's on his own. He's a drunk. He's not a tough guy. He's not actually going to take action against her. And I think that there certainly was and is an element of regret that they didn't take those threats more seriously, because it wasn't as though he just made those behind closed doors, or that he abused her physically in places that nobody could see. While there wasn't physical abuse, there certainly was known verbal abuse and known tension that ultimately led to that night in 1979 where she went missing and was never seen from again.
Yeah, it's really tragic just to hear about all of the build up to it. And so once she's missing, what happens next? Do investigators go to the home? Is there any evidence of a struggle there?
Yeah, so the way the rules worked at that point, this is Yolo County Sheriff's Department, which became the investigating agency. They were required to wait 72 hours before opening up an official missing persons investigation. So while there were multiple family members, including Carl, who called the police the day that she went missing, the department wasn't, I guess they were able to, but they chose not to officially investigate for a few days. And so after that 72-hour waiting period was up, a detective by the name of Ron Heileman became the lead investigator. He shows up to the house. He goes through, room by room, searches the property. It's a 5-acre parcel of land with, a lot of places you could hide a body in theory, right? There was nothing inside the house that looked out of place, but on the day she went missing, her keys were behind, her prescription medication was behind, her wedding ring was left behind, her reading glasses, all the possessions that she would have needed to, if she was trying to escape an abusive situation, everything she would have needed was still at the house. So it was pretty easy to dismiss out of hand that, okay, she didn't, if she just disappeared on her own, there's a lot of logic that doesn't add up here. And so as Detective Heileman continued to comb the scene, he had Carl open up the garage and, from there open up his car. This is really where the physical evidence ends up being located, and it's not, it's not, he didn't have him dead to rights with what they found, but it was enough to indicate that something was wrong. And so he opens the trunk of this old blue Oldsmobile, um, finds a blanket in there that has a splotch of red, right? And the assumption was that it was blood, and sure enough, it was. Later, they were able to test it and make the determination that it was Dolores's blood type. Now, at the time, remember, this is 1979. They weren't able to do a DNA match to confirm that it was definitively hers, but they knew it was her blood type, which is, not nothing. Carl tried to explain it away, that they had been making love and on this blanket at a picnic. It was, obviously he was just trying to create a story, and the detective saw right through that. Um, then he continues to go through the trunk. He finds a single earring that fell to the trunk of the car as he's lifting the blanket. He looks at Carl. He says, "Is this Dolores's?" And he's like, "Well, I guess it might have been something to that effect." And then the third piece of evidence that Detective Heilman told us about, and this is corroborated in documents, etc., is that there was a streak of four fingers inside the trunk. And there's no pictures of anything at this point in time. But the way Heileman described it to us, it was like he imagined it was like he came to the conclusion, and this is theory, right? But that Dolores was alive in the trunk, was trying to open the trunk, and there's the four fingers streaking down the inside of the trunk. This is grime and grease and dirt and all of that. They weren't able to lift any fingerprints off that, just with the material that was in play. But there was enough there for him to have a really strong suspicion that Dolores was probably removed from the property in the trunk of that car.
That's so disturbing and just a really terrible thing to imagine. And you have like these, three pieces of evidence between the finger slides, the earring, and the bloody blanket. But I mean, Adam, is it enough? Is it enough to bring charges?
Not initially, and this is the frustration of that time period, is that they didn't have enough to determine that those were her fingerprints. Obviously, they determined that was her blood type, but there are plausible explanations of why it could have ended up on the blanket, other than just something that occurred that night before. The other thing was that the house, you could smell bleach, that there was bleach used recently before Detective Eilerman showed up. That was another noticeable part. But again, without a body, without anyone having seen him drive off necessarily, or know where he could have taken her. It was they were still somewhat at a standstill. So that was the kind of initial evidence. But right away, not only did her family suspect that Carl Wulff was responsible, but Ron Heileman did as well. And that was a theme throughout our reporting, is that there wasn't, people that were directly involved. It wasn't like there were five other suspects. They all believed that this was Carl Wulff. It was just a matter of proving that he was guilty of this crime.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Was there anyone else that they thought could have potentially committed this? Or were there similar crimes in the area? Were women disappearing? Was there a serial killer on the loose, sort of thing? But doesn't sound like it.
Well, it's actually funny you mentioned that, Claire, because later in the story, this is a little bit of a tangent, but in Northern California at the time, there were other prominent serial killers, right? The Golden State Killer was patrolling that area around that time. The Zodiac Killer was also operational in that part of the state, and there's some intersection there that we actually are able to lay out
Oh, wow.
in the podcast. That's pretty interesting. We'll save that. We'll save that for the actual
Sure.
podcast. But yeah, there was, it was very clear based on all the evidence that there was one prime suspect. There was no one else that would have had any reason. There was no lingering beef with her or anything or anyone else. It was pretty clear that all the evidence pointed to Carl Wolf, but the DA at the time, who we interviewed for the podcast, wasn't convinced. He was convinced that Carl was responsible, but he wasn't convinced that he could get a conviction in court. And so they went on for years waiting for a body to turn up. Um, and that process never played out.
And so, Adam, tell me what her family, Dolores's family, was doing at this time, because it sounds like they weren't just taking, the police's word for the final word.
No, right. So I think it's important for those who listen to the podcast to realize there was it was official investigations that went on, and sometimes took very, very long to ever get anywhere. And then at the same time, there was a unofficial investigation that was going on from Dolores's family. So they were not the type of family to just sit there and let the legal process play out while their loved one was missing. And so there's a couple of different things that went on in those initial months, but certainly even in the years that followed. One of the main ones that we'll explore in the podcast is these search parties that went out and actually tried to dig fields and riverbeds and anywhere that they thought he might have put her body to try to find something. And this is not a small area. This is a large rural area. They grow all sorts of crops out there. This family had been in the area for a couple of generations, so they knew the area. But the idea of hey, let's get 10 people and go out and dig over here. They did that over and over and over, especially some of the younger cousins of Dolores Wulff. The other thing that they ended up doing, especially when it seemed like there wasn't going to be an immediate arrest of Carl, was to apply all sorts of pressure to him. Basically anything short of physical violence, and they considered physical violence towards him. So that this family, created signs, leading up to his house. Hey, the murder, this way to the murder's house, and did all sorts of things to pressure him into either leading them to a body or to confessing or what have you. So that was some of the kind of wilder parts of the story, is that her family, while processing its own grief and guilt, and so maybe in some cases for not taking action before she went missing, they did some wild stuff to try to get some answers out of Carl Wolf.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I read about that in your article, even the idea that they at one point put a bumper sticker on his car. Kyle, what did that bumper sticker say?
The bumper sticker said, "I killed my wife." I mean, this family is, first of all, they were incredible to communicate with over the last several years. They're just all such good storytellers. But there was no shame here in the types of action they took against Carl Wolf. I mean, they left dead animal carcasses on his property. They threw jars of urine through his window. They painted murder on his garage door. They cut the power to his house. They chased him out of grocery stores and out of meetings with it's not the city council, but some local club or something like that in town. Everywhere Carl Wolf went in Woodland for those first couple of years, he had a shadow, and it was some sort of the Rocha family shadow, chased him everywhere he went. He essentially became, a prisoner in his own town, and eventually had to leave the area.
Yeah, it's incredible that he stayed as long as he did, considering how difficult they made it for him.
Yeah. I mean, Kyle mentioned. I mean, he was a guy that and as we'll explain in the podcast, he tried to move on with his life very quickly. Even telling his kids, your mom is gone and she's not coming back. So made it very clear, at least from his mentality, that he was moving forward with his life. But the Rocha cousins, Dolores came from her maiden name was Rocha. They really made life difficult on him, and yeah, like Kyle mentioned, showing up, being very aware of any girlfriends he had, and making it clear to them what they believed he had done, and just making it really really difficult for him to make a living and kind of go forward after that point. And I mean, there was a armed confrontations. I mean, there are all sorts of things that happened during those years that they again hoped would yield justice from Carl Wolf, because they, other than Ron Heileman, who Kyle mentioned, that lead detective, they didn't have a lot of faith in the local authorities to ultimately bring him to justice.
And so tell me about, an unusual development that happened. There were actually some charges brought against Carl at one point.
Yeah, so about 5 years after Dolores went missing, the local DA had made it very clear that it was not going to file murder charges against Carl Wolf. Without a body, he just didn't think he could win the case. But as these things tend to do, the leadership changed over. There was a new DA. The interim DA who replaced the initial one, he also passed on filing charges. And then there was a third. And at this point, there had been no new developments for several years, right? The case had been cold for years at this point. But the Roaches weren't ready to give up. They continued to place pressure on local authorities wherever possible, and finally found the right trigger point. And that was going to the Attorney General's office in Sacramento and laying out their case there. And at that point, the AG agreed with the family, hey, there's enough here to bring murder charges. We'll go ahead and take the case. But, there's turf wars here, right? And I'm sure it was probably even worse in 1979. So when the Yolo County District Attorney's Office found out that the AG was ready to step in and file charges, it said, kind of threw up his hands and said, okay, never mind, we'll go ahead and do it. We'll handle this ourselves. So they do file a murder charge against Carl Wolf. 5 years later, and then the over the next year, there were several preliminary hearings and other court proceedings as they tried to get to the root of the case. This isn't a spoiler, but ultimately Carl Wolf is not convicted. A visiting judge from another county determined that the local DA violated his right to a speedy trial by waiting more than 5 years to file charges. So it wasn't based on the merits of the evidence. They're not saying he's innocent, anything like that. It was just saying he got off on a murder charge on a technicality. It's something that haunted the detective who investigated the case. It's something that the original DA, became conflicted about and expressed that to us in an interview. He lays out his own kind of, how he kind of weighed this emotionally for several decades. And then Carl Wolf went on and moved on with his life.
And I think it's important to know, like, that original district attorney, a man named Rick Gilbert, really laid it out to us that, hey, we only had one chance to charge him, and they obviously believed that chance was at its best with the body, with more physical evidence to get a conviction. And so, in a sense, though, by waiting for a body to turn up, the clock ran out. What a judge eventually ruled the way that he did, that, hey, this guy did not have a right to a speedy trial, in part because they were waiting so long for that body to turn up. So just a really difficult situation. But yeah, the entire year of 1985 pretty much were these series of legal proceedings. And there's even a scene where Paul Wolf, the son, who's obviously in college football, tries to get his dad to confess, and but essentially, Carl did end up walking free at the end of 1985.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to have, him right in that spot where I think everyone wants to see justice and believe that they have, the charges finally filed, and to have this loophole, not based on the evidence, but based on, criminal procedure. is got to be so frustrating.
Not only that, but I think the family, even 45 years later, is still very frustrated by how the deputy district attorney tried the case and handled the case at the time. Um, this was a case that they didn't want to try. It was kind of they were forced into this process, and there was clearly no dedication towards winning a conviction. They kind of went through the motions during this process. We lay out all of this in one episode in particular, just all the missteps that the district attorney made along the way, and was really willing to concede defeat rather quickly, and didn't put up a case. So you wonder, like, all of this, you wonder how would things might have been differently. How would they
Yeah.
have played out differently if one you filed it earlier, if you had um, a DA who was he's staunch in his belief that this case should be tried and that they had enough. Like, you can't change those things 4 decades later. But as we'll later learn, other developments certainly made people kind of try to reconcile with those decisions that were made.
Yeah, and this is justice pending. So my listeners are always interested in cases that don't have outcomes that are tidy, and they don't have, the resolution that so many cases get. And that's why we want to shine a light on, stories that are still being told. And I know that my listeners will love your podcast, and it's coming out August 4th, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. The first 2 episodes, August 4th, and then we'll have, additional episodes the next, I think, 8 Mondays, so pretty exciting.
Yeah, it is. Well, I guess, just final thoughts on why the story of Dolores Wulff, needed to be told. What did you really want to make sure that people learned?
Yeah.
So there's a really it's a really complex story that spans 41 years, right? There is a twist that we'll lay out early in the podcast that should hook people and make them interested. It's why we were hooked when we found out. I mean, I guess I could get into a little bit of it now. Is that in 2020, Paul Wolf, who was 12 when his mom went missing, took a call from a detective in a nearby city, and that phone call started with the detective saying, "Paul, we found your mom."
Wow.
And so working backwards from that it was really an incredible journey to go on, learning about how the family processed the twists and turns, this roller coaster of emotions that they went through was really kind of inspiring to hear how they dealt with everything. There's a lot of really interesting characters that we'll able to introduce and go off into interesting tangents on. Like I said before, a lot of the subjects we spoke with are just fantastic storytellers and just entertaining to sit back and listen to. So in this format, in an audio format, having the ability to let these people, give them some space, let them tell their story, and kind of let Adam and I shepherd everyone along has been a really it's a fantastic professional experience to go through, because these are incredible people who dealt with tragedy and they persevered and came out better on the other side.
Yeah, I think it's a story of a family that never gave up on its hopes of finding a loved one. And I think the case itself is interesting, and I know you explore so many interesting cases on your podcast, Claire. But I think for us, the people and the emotional component probably makes ours, in our hope, stand out. And there's all these wild, connections. I mean, there's a Lacey Peterson, Scott Peterson connection to this case. There's even a Kim Kardashian, Kanye West connection.
Oh,
That's
wow.
sort of a very very peripheral one, but there's connections to the Vietnam War and to the civil rights movement through one exceptional character that we explore in episode 4. There's obviously a sports angle where Paul Wolf, plays high level college football and coaches in the NFL and in college football. So I think the story touches a lot of different areas that will interest people beyond just the case itself, which is also really interesting. And again, we're just really grateful for Wes, and to have a chance to bring these characters out more, because they were really special for us. We deal with a lot of interesting people in our day jobs, but I don't know if there's been a collection of people that I've talked with for a story that approaches the Rocha family and the others that we talked to for this piece.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this case. And I know everyone's going to go check out season 3 of The Unforgotten, Finding Dolores Wulff, available everywhere you get podcasts.
Thanks so much for having us, Claire. We had a good time discussing the case, and hopefully everyone else will get as invested into it as we have for the last few years.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, tune in next week, guys, for an all-new episode of Justice Pending. And until then, stay safe, stay skeptical, and stay curious. Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanama, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air. Thanks for joining us.